The Untouchables. V's. The Mafia. Real story. During the 1920s and 30s, America was dominated by organized crime. Bootlegging, kidnapping, hijacking, and murder were just everyday occurrences. The Mafia made millions upon millions of dollars every single year, and they seemed untouchable. But there was one man who took it upon himself to bring them down. His name was Eliot Ness, and he was gone not do anything it took to put an end to the mob. Welcome back to the channel. Today we will be discussing how Eliot Ness and his team took down Al Capone. Let's get into it. In the 1930s, Chicago was run by the Mafia. At the time, bootlegging was still very much a thing, and Capone's Chicago outfit controlled almost all of it in the city. That meant they had control over almost all of the money coming into the city. And with that kind of cash flow, they were able to move into other areas such as gambling, prostitution, and even politics. By this point, the police force was completely corrupt and couldn't do anything about it. So the federal government stepped in and created a new special task force, whose sole job was to bring down the Mafia. They called it the Untouchables. But before we can go into that, let's talk about some of the insane things that the Mafia did at this point. Back then, if you didn't like someone or if they got in your way, you could just have them killed, and no one would do anything about it. There was even a case where two men kidnapped the son of a rival mob boss and then demanded a $50,000 ransom for him. To make matters worse, when they dropped the boy off once they received the money, he had been beaten, tortured, and raped. It was not unusual to find people stuffed in barrels, drowned in the river, or blown up by remote control bombs. This was especially true during the gang wars of the 1920s, which claimed hundreds of lives. And as you can imagine, the cops weren't really interested in solving any of these crimes, seeing as most of them were on the mob payroll. So you can probably guess why this task force was created. Initially, the plan was to have the Bureau of Prohibition handle it. But that fell through after it was discovered that many of the agents were also taking bribes from the mob. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover, who headed the Bureau of Investigation, was so frustrated about the lack of results that he went directly to Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon and asked him to create a new group. And that is how the Untouchables came to be. It wasn't easy being a part of the Untouchables. Most of the agents were paid more than double their usual salaries. But that came with a big risk. If you were an agent and you were caught taking a bribe, you would not only be fired, but you would also be put on the first available train to Washington, D.C., where you would never get sent back. Eliot Ness was born in Chicago on April 19, 1903. After graduating from the University of Chicago with a degree in political science, he joined the Treasury Department's intelligence unit. When he heard about the new task force being assembled, he immediately wrote a letter to his boss asking to be put on it. He was put in charge of the operation because he had experience dealing with the mob and was considered one of the smartest agents the department had ever seen. His first move was to assemble his team. He chose 7 agents based purely on merit and loyalty. Frank Nitti, Joseph T. MacOS, Samuel J. Pizarczy, Harry Peavy, Charles F. McLaughlin, Marie Matthew, and Philip D. Vichant. Their main target was, of course, Al Capone. Unlike most criminals, Capone wasn't afraid of going to prison. He knew that his vast wealth would allow him to live comfortably while behind bars. What he was afraid of, however, was taxes. Ness and his team were aware of this, and so they began digging through Capone's finances. The problem was, they couldn't find anything. Capone was careful to keep everything above board. All of his money went through legitimate businesses, and all of his expenses were accounted for. But then Ness's team found something interesting. Capone owned several restaurants and bars, and those places regularly ordered more liquor than they could possibly sell. That meant that the rest of the alcohol was being sold illegally on the streets, and that gave Ness's team a way in. They began tracking the shipments of alcohol from breweries to Capone's bars and restaurants. And sure enough, they found that the truckers were selling the liquor to bootleggers once they delivered it. From there, it wasn't too hard to track the bootleggers back to the mob. Ness and his team arrested dozens of bootleggers and gangsters, all of which were closely tied to Capone. That, of course, didn't sit well with the mob boss, and so he tried to bribe Ness to stop. When that failed, he tried to threaten him. There is a famous story about how Ness and his wife were invited to Capone's home for dinner. According to Ness, Capone kept trying to bribe him during the meal, but he refused. Eventually, Capone got so angry that he stood up, walked up to Ness, and said, "You're a nice guy. Ness, why don't you leave this thing to the cops? "You're not going to win." Ness responded, "I'm going to win because I'm not on the take." Capone then stormed out of the room. After that meeting, Ness and his family were constantly under surveillance. Mobsters followed them around everywhere they went. They even broke into their house and planted bugs all throughout it. Ness was certain that Capone was going to try and kill him, and he was right. One day, Ness received an anonymous phone call telling him to come to a certain garage at 4 p.m. When he arrived, found a Cadillac with the motor running and a note on the seat that read, "Get in." Ness assumed it was a trap, and so he called the police and told them to surround the building. When the suspect got into the car, they were met with a swarm of police officers. They were all wearing masks and carrying Thompson's submachine guns. The driver sped off, but he didn't get far. The police eventually cornered him and brought him in for questioning. Turned out to be a small-time gangster named Jake Greasy, Tom Guzik, apparently. Capone had ordered him to drive Ness to an undisclosed location, at which point another car would pull up and he would be killed. We don't know exactly what happened to Guzik after that, but it's safe to say he didn't live much longer. As the years passed, Ness and his team continued to arrest members of the mob. They worked with state and local officials to tighten the net around Capone and his associates. In 1931, they finally had enough evidence to bring charges against him. He was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. While he was only supposed to serve 3 years, he actually ended up serving 7.5. He was released in 1939 and spent the remainder of his life running a casino and a hotel in Florida. Over the course of the next few years, the rest of the mob bosses suffered the same fate. The Untouchables broke up the gangs and sent the leaders to prison. For decades afterward, Chicago was much safer. While the Untouchables were undoubtedly heroes, there was a lot of controversy surrounding them. Many people, including some of the agents themselves, claimed that much of the work was done by the police. Technically, that's true, but the police didn't want any credit for it. They were still on the mob-S payroll at this point and didn't want to jeopardize their positions. The Untouchables worked hand in hand with the police, but ultimately the results were their own. After the mob had been mostly taken care of, Ness left the Treasury Department and became the Director of Public Safety in Cleveland. He was elected as a county commissioner in 1960 and served until 1971. He died on May 16, 1957, from a heart attack at the age of 54. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please make sure to leave a thumbs up. Thanks for watching.